folks, good morning. Ed, you good? I'm so happy that you're here. Yeah. Hi guys, good morning. It's good to see everyone. Good morning to those on Zoom as well. It's nice to resume Holo the Bagel after we had to rest, recover last week from some Jewish holiday ritual. Not sure what it was. Like some party at the JCC. I don't know. Anyways, we had to recover, so there was 1 week's gap. But we're here resuming, and I'm so happy that we're able to have our very own Leslie Newman give us this talk. As you know, Holo the Bagel is kind of like loosely related to the Jewish year cycle, whether they're weekly portions or some holiday or some events that are happening in our American calendar. In this case, it's actually kind of both. Why? Because last week was Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. The twist of this year is that they just proved last week that Columbus was Jewish. They did some DNA, so it's our fault as well, right? It's like we did that too, guilty, right? So that's a little Jewish connection. But the deeper Jewish connection is that it's also now the holiday of Sukkot. And Sukkot is a holiday that reminds us that we used to be nomadic people, right? That before we had a connection to a land, we were nomadic. And that element of being nomadic is part of our culture, right? You can think about the modern day wandering Jew. You can think about the Israelites in the desert. So while Judaism has a very close relation to a land, right? Usually the land of Israel, but not only. Jews are within many countries. There's also this notion that we're also the wandering people, right? And then connecting it to indigenous people of America, before it was even called America, we know that this land was once predominantly, I wouldn't say owned, but inhabited by tribes of nomadic people, and then a lot of things happened, right? And these people are still around. And Leslie Newman, actually, that's what she does in her day job, right? She's part of the Seven Sister Community Development Group, which is a for-profit organization that tries to do good things in the world in regards of housing for the indigenous people of America. And therefore, what does that say here, actually?
Much of her work is in indigenous communities.
Yeah, okay, so I just couldn't make that. And because it's called Seven Sisters, it has 6 partners. I don't know how that happened, but Leslie is one of them, and we're very happy to hear you talk about your work. I think that we know that there are indigenous people, Native Americans. We don't necessarily know so much about them and how they live and what are their challenges. So we're very excited for you to make all those connections between us, the Jews, and the indigenous people of America. Looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's exciting to be here, and basically it's kind of connecting my 2 worlds. I have my temple world, and then I have my work world, and this morning I get to talk about my work world and my temple world. So exciting intersection here. And there's a lot to talk about, so the idea of doing it in like an hour is, oh my gosh, everybody who knows me, I mean, we know I talk a lot, we know I can talk for the day, and we actually, Seven Sisters has a course on working with Native communities, and it's 2 days long. So this is not a condensed version, that would be impossible, but I've tried to really look at, again, sort of the indigenous, not experience, because I'm not indigenous, I'm not speaking from an indigenous perspective, I'm speaking from a Jewish perspective, but making some connections. So to start with, just want to ask, when we celebrate Sukkot, why do we have the sukkah, and what is this about?
Isn't it after like the harvest, and isn't it like supposed to be like you're supposed to be able to? That's all I got.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's absolutely harvest, right? It's a seasonal thing. It's the harvest, but why the sukkah? So again, you can see out. It's not a permanent shelter, right? But who else was in the sukkah a while ago, right? Who had that?
The journey from the people during the 40 years on in the desert.
Right,
and-
right, right. Exactly. So it was our history, right? So we start Sukkah. If we look at Sukkot, we're looking at history. That's why we're in the Sukkah last night, today, right? So that's where we will start this as well, because we want to look at housing, what's happening in Indigenous communities now. Primarily, we'll talk about reservations, but to understand that now, we have to look at the history. Just like, why are we in the Sukkah? Because of where we were, thousands of years ago. So in terms of today, hopefully this will work.
You need to use the,
Maybe like this? Oh, no. Okay, this is not moving at all. Can you
well, you
talk?
can't have it all. You want Zoom and then, let me see. How about if I do this?
Sure.
Does
Okay,
that work?
sure.
Tell me
So-
when you want to move it.
okay.
Can you see, am I blocking?
Okay, so I can actually, now that you did that, it works
Oh,
fine.
all right,
We
good.
won't worry about the,
Leslie, you
can I shrink these guys?
Yes, so they can,
Okay.
they can still see
Oh, okay, if you minimize them?
minimize.
I'll make it,
Okay, perfect. So they're in someplace in the, okay. Well, when I do full screen for some reason, I can't, you wanted to help me? I can't, okay. So anyway, so history is our starting point. We're gonna look a little bit at some history, and then these are some historical timelines that we have sort of around the room that we'll go through quickly. Again, high level, kind of broad brush. This isn't a history lesson. Okay, so now let's try, now it works. Okay, thank you, Lisa.
there you go.
Okay. Okay, so then we're gonna take a look at land. Then we're gonna look at, well, again, what does housing look like now in Indigenous communities, some promising practices, some themes, and also where can we go from here? Because it's not just, hey, this is happening, but how can we connect to this, right? So our first picture here, Mark asked, is this Ganandigan, right? That is the cultural center, and it had been, there was a village there, right? So how many people here have been to Ganandigan? Almost everybody. So I think that's amazing, and it's a great starting point. So looking at history, so again, this is how things used to be, and we talk about being nomadic people. These are the lands that different tribes inhabited, right? So again, historically, so you have huge swaths of land. So like the Lenape people here, this again is like New York. This is again before our state borders. This is how things used to be. And again, tribes, so the Great Plains tribes were, like the Lakota were here. Again, huge swaths of land. So what we want to compare that to is now,
Yeah.
right? So a huge, huge difference. So what strikes you about that? When you look at that picture, especially comparatively, what strikes you?
They're not, the lands aren't contiguous, they're separated.
They're little pockets, right? Exactly, they're not continuous. What else? What do you see here on the East Coast? Nothing, right. What do you see here on the East Coast? A lot, right? So that's where we are. People were moved, and we'll talk about that. Anything else strike you?
Straight line.
This is good.
Thank you, Joyce. So straight lines, right? So it is, borders aren't natural, right? They're not rivers. You have rivers going through reservations, and they're not, just like honestly, if you look at the U.S.-Mexico border, you look at and actually if you look at the Akwesasne, the Mohawk in northern New York, the U.S.-Canada border goes right through the reservation. And that gets tricky in terms of citizenship, in terms of crossing borders. You can imagine how that was during COVID when the Canadian border was closed. In Arizona, you have the Tohono O'odham, where the U.S.-Mexico border goes through that too. So you have complications, and right, these are not natural borders, absolutely. So again, this is giving us some context. So now we just want to take a brief, kind of broad brush look at these colonial periods and thinking about not history in a vacuum, but history and its impact on housing today. So basically you have, these are really 7 periods, and these match, if folks want to take these, we can also give it to you over email, but you have the pre-Columbian period, so before Columbus got here, then you have the colonial period, and then folks were starting to come, the colonists were starting to come from Europe. And in that time, relations were generally okay, because why do you think they were okay?
There weren't so many Europeans.
Yes, there weren't that many people, and they weren't looking to expand. So they're like, hey, we just got here, and generally, not perfect at all, but generally fairly peaceful in the colonial period. Then we have in 1828, so after, we have the Revolution, War of Independence, that kind of thing, the removal, reservation, and treaty period. And these were not periods that Seven Sisters or I made up. These were official US names for these periods and these acts. So you have the Removal Act, for example, that removed people, again, from the lands that they were inhabiting. So 1828 to 1887. So what you're doing, and why is that happening? Why are they removing people from, again, like the East Coast that we talked about? Take over the land. Okay, we're more and more people. Now we need more land, especially we're arriving on the East Coast, so we want that land first, and then we'll move westward, right? So we're gonna remove you. So you have the Removal Act in Congress. And then what you're doing is you're saying, well, you've been living in this huge swath of land, but you're gonna now live here on a reservation. Again, the small little pockets that we saw. And we're gonna have treaties with you. And we see you as nations, right? You are sovereign nations, so it's a nation-to-nation treaty. You're gonna live in this little piece of land, and we're gonna take care of you. We're gonna provide food and shelter and services that you need. So removal, reservation, and treaty period. And one thing I wanna call out is there's something called the Marshall Trilogy. Has anyone heard of this? So 3 court cases in the early 1800s, still within this period, like the beginning of this period. And there were 3 Supreme Court cases. These opinions were written by John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was like a slave owner. So when you think about kind of what was going on at that time, not Mr. kind of enlightened, I would say. But you have the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia was one of these 3 Marshall Trilogy cases. And it was basically the Cherokee, there was a push to remove the Cherokee Nation from Georgia. And so the Cherokee Nation pushed back and said, no, this is our home. So basically the state of Georgia was stopped from pushing them out at that time, but that led to the Trail of Tears where the Cherokee Nation was pushed to Oklahoma. Okay, but there are 2 important things that came out of this. One is the duty of protection. The US, because it holds ownership over Indian lands, must protect the Indians from all hostiles. How did that happen? I mean, do you think that worked? Did that happen? No. And who were the hostiles? It was the US Army itself, right? So like this doesn't make any sense. And we have the guardian-ward relationship. The US holds all land and resources in trust for the Indians, creating a fiduciary duty. So when you think of guardian-ward relationship, who do you think of?
Parent and child.
Parent and child, right. So it's not a relationship of equals, nation to nation. It's a very patronizing, we will take care of you. And again, from what we know, how did they do with that duty? Not great, no. So again, and these people refer to these, and so land right now on most reservations is held in trust for the Indian people by the federal government, which we'll get to. That impacts housing, right? Because is a lender, so land cannot be collateral for a mortgage because it is in this trust status. So how do you think a bank is going to feel about a mortgage where they can't take the land? Again, so they're going to be hesitant. Lenders are hesitant, and Native American tribal members are hesitant because of this trust status. But the other piece here is this Johnson versus McIntosh. There were 2 people that bought a piece of land. One bought it from a Native American tribal member. The other bought it from someone else. So again, who had ownership of that land? Indians enjoyed only a right of occupancy to the land, which is a base for the U.S., one of the bases for the U.S. to exert control over the tribal lands. So if you're occupying it, you don't own it. It's really who discovered it. So they're saying the U.S. government, the U.S. discovered it, so we have the ownership of it. Okay, so crazy, right? And these are seminal, these are key doctrines that still impact things today. Okay. So then you have people on reservations, but until 1887, people were living communally on the reservation. And then in 1887, again, because it was this real push towards assimilation, and you have to be like other Americans and the colonists, we're going to take these reservations and we're going to cut them up into little allotments, but under the Allotment Act of 1887, or the Dawes Act, and every family is going to get an allotment. I think it was 160 acres. So those allotments pass on through time, and as you meet people, depending on the reservation, they will have an allotment. But again, it's that same allotment that their ancestors got back in 1887. So you think, 1887, and then a few more, then another generation, another generation. So you can have hundreds of people owning that 160 acres. And let's say I want to build a house on maybe 2.5 acres. I need the permission of everybody else to do it because of this trust status. So again, push toward assimilation, and you see here on the photos, this is have folks seen this photo before?
No.
That's when someone was going to boarding school and what happens, right? Cutting your hair, you can't speak your language. So the boarding school, the residential schools are a whole nother topic that we're not going to dive into, but it's hugely important and it's impacted people towards until today.
Isn't it an important point that the land which had been held communally, then because of the imposition of these laws, then became land owned by individual families?
Yes.
So it was no longer, it was just a whole different system.
Right.
That the Indians really didn't relate to.
Right, it was enforced, it was definitely
Yeah.
forced upon people, it was not how people chose to live. And even the term ownership, it was like, you don't really own it, but again, ownership is kind of a Western concept.
Yeah.
They didn't own it, it was land that, people are completely attached to the land, but didn't feel ownership of it. But you're right, it was a completely different way of living. And when you look at some of the issues now, some of the challenges, because of all these pieces that were enforced, you have to live in this area, you have to live in this special part, and then not special, but you have to live in this specific part. But the other thing that we see in the next period is there was a report in the late 1900s called the Merriam Report that said, hey, things aren't going very well in these communities. There's poverty, there's depression, there's a lot of illness and death, because again, the system that was imposed did not work at all, right? So they said, we're gonna reorganize here. And basically the US government told, and there's an IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. We're gonna stop doing reservations, we're gonna work with the tribes, but in order for the tribes to receive services and programming, you need to have a Western form of government. You need to have a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary. And again, is that how folks were living before? No. You had people that were appointed for you definitely had tribal leaders, but not president, vice president, elected. So what we see now is people have looked at, researchers recently have looked at economic development in different tribal communities. Some tribal communities pushed back and said, nope, we're not going to take your services and programming. We are going to retain our inherent form of leadership and government. And they are, if you look according to the research, more successful with economic development and just generally how their life is. Some of the pueblos, for example, in the Southwest said no, they refuse this form of government. They still have their traditional form of leadership. But some of the tribes, like in the Great Plains, they said, okay, in order to get these goods and services and programming and food, really, because again, people, Rebecca, I know you were in South Dakota in the summer, right? The Badlands, right? So it wasn't like people were given prime land. They were forced to live in these lands called the Badlands, which later, what was discovered in some of these Badlands?
Oil.
Yeah, oil, uranium, coal, all sorts of resources. And then so the communities were destroyed again, with environmental issues and problems, right? But they were called Badlands for a reason. So they're made to live on these Badlands. So anyway, the tribes that I've worked the most with in the Great Plains in South Dakota, they accepted this form of government. They have elections every 2 years. What kind of stable government is that? So a president comes in, you start working with them, they start doing great programming, and then they're out. Versus in other places where, again, you have leaders who have been there for 10 or 15 years, or even more, right? So you have this reorganization period. And again, this is, I think, very symbolic. This is John Collier he was a US government official standing with his tribal representatives. Then you have this termination period. Okay, you have these reservations and tribes around the country. Again, we want to eliminate tribal nations, right? So we're going to take away the reservation status. We're going to ignore the treaties that we developed with them. We're going to terminate their status. So that means all of the services, the programming that they were entitled to under law and under treaty, not going to get anymore. So part of it was ending the federal recognition of some tribes, mostly smaller tribes in the Pacific Northwest, but also the Menominee of Wisconsin, some bigger tribes in Oregon, and tribes have been fighting ever since to get their recognition back, which is a whole big process. And some tribes have done it successfully, but there was also a move, again, when you're just trying to destroy this culture, move to the city, right? So that's why if you look many cities have large, New York, I think New York City has the largest indigenous population in the US, right? But part of this was in the 40s and 50s, this is a flyer that was encouraging people to move to the city, happy homes, work, this and that. And, was it very successful? No. Because again, it sort of lured people to the city, no support systems, no assistance. And so a lot of people moved home. They were like, and I have one of my colleagues, she's Navajo. She was raised in Arizona. And I said, oh, where were you born? And I thought, in the hospital closest to her where she was raised. So I was born in Cleveland. Cleveland. Well, yeah, my dad, basically they came to the community and said, we're putting the young men on buses to get trained. So he was like, well, I think I'd like to be an electrician, but the bus was full. Yeah.
Are these people recognized as US citizens?
Yes, absolutely. But guess when they got the vote? 1924. So again, how long have these people been here? So 100 years. They're celebrating the vote, 1924. They are absolutely US citizens. They're also citizens of the states in which they live. So if there are statewide programs to benefit, New Yorkers or people from South Dakota, but state governments, sometimes there have been, I would say, different recognitions of, again, what state citizenship means. Because in South Dakota, where I work, for example, there's housing money that comes in to support housing, federal money, other state funds to support housing, and they'll say no to the tribes. No, you have your own money that you're getting directly as tribes. You don't need this money. But the money that the tribes get is not nearly enough. And so people argue, well, we're also citizens of South Dakota. When you're doing a census and you're doing population counts, you're still counting us. So yeah, they're absolutely, that's a great question though. Great question. So anyway, we had the termination period. And then we have self-determination sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, really up to 2000. So yeah.
You mentioned that some of the tribes started getting their recognition back, but how did they decide who was a recognizable tribe or not?
Well, they have a whole procedure that you have to, I'm not sure what happened here. Lisa?
Yes, I don't know.
The whole thing?
The whole screen went off. The computer is on.
We don't know nothing about it. That's like a Ryan question.
That is so weird.
Yeah.
We can see it.
Oh, we might have to,
We can see it.
you can see it? Oh, they can see it.
Yeah.
We can't see
Oh,
any.
it's our screen. The screen turned off somehow.
Okay.
I'm just, I don't know how to get it back to the HDMI. Is it HDMI?
I think so.
Yes.
Is there let's see.
That is really.
Leslie wants to answer the question.
Yes. Okay, so the question was how, so there's a whole process by which the US government really looks at tribes to determine if they can get their recognition back, a whole elaborate process. So again, a great question. There are some tribes that actually, like especially in our region, like in New Jersey, that there were tribes, some of the folks were moved out to, so basically the US was trying to get people to move west, the tribal members, and some people refused. So, but part of it was, if you move, we will grant you federal recognition. So you have the Lenape, for example, that was our whole region. You have the Lenape that still exists, that still live in New Jersey. They are not federally recognized because they didn't take the deal. They said, no, we're not moving. They resisted, right? And then you have the people in Oklahoma that have Lenape federal recognition in Oklahoma because they took the deal, basically. And so you would assume, oh, well, all of the Lenape people, they're getting along, everything. No. Because the people who stayed in New Jersey think that the Oklahoma people are sellouts because and the people that live in Oklahoma think that the people who stayed in New Jersey are not actual, authentic tribal members.
Question.
So, yeah.
Isn't your language there a little imprecise? Because you say the people who took the deal,
Yes.
and really it's their grandparents.
Right. The tribal, yes, you're right. I could be much more, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, they didn't, it's not the people, it's their ancestors. But I think what's interesting is that we keep seeing today the impact of what.
Their ancestors.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't make the choice, their ancestors did. Yeah, but that's a great point. And again, we see it sort of blowing through everything we're talking about, is the ancestors. But again, when people were sent to boarding school, for example, that could have been grandparents or great-grandparents, but you see the impacts today. So people that I work with didn't go to boarding school, but the impact on their family, because again, the kids, they were raised by grandparents, for example, because the people who went to boarding school sort of checked out sometimes because of, yes, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, but again, absolutely right. Okay, so thank you, Anne, for encouraging me, because Anne is a professor, she's used to being up here and doing this PowerPoint stuff. Okay, alrighty, so what was happening in the, yeah.
I was just curious, like what the population of Native Americans now is, so I just Googled it, and it's roughly the same as the Indigenous.
Really? Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very, yeah.
100,000.
Yeah. And how, I mean, were you surprised? Did you think there were more or less?
Oh, I thought it would be far fewer than Native Americans.
Right. Because you sort of,
Let's get rid of this.
right.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you wonder if they vote, and that's a huge question because I think politicians are very aware of their voting power. And so if you look at Arizona voting in the last election, they made a huge impact. So politicians, I think the Harris campaign has like 18 people on staff in Arizona to get out yeah. So, and in Indigenous Peoples Day, there was a Sinai contingent that had a voter registration table in the rain and the cold to encourage people to vote, but absolutely. And what's also exciting is that depending on the folks that win the election, right now the lieutenant governor in Minnesota is a tribal member. So that will be the first state to have a Native woman governor or Native at all governor in the US.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you address the problem between the Lakota tribe and the Jews? It was a problem.
Okay, I don't know about the problem. So do you want to tell us a little bit?
The problem over the land.
Over the land. Oh, because homesteaders wanted the land. Is that? So I don't know a lot about it. I can certainly, I want to learn more about it, but basically I think it was probably like, hey, we were here, and then people were again moving west, wanted the land. And so there were definitely conflicts over land, not just with Jewish people, but with homesteaders all across the country. Absolutely. So it has not been a peaceful history. So I think that's part of what you're referring to. But back to the 60s, back to our timeline. What was happening in the 60s? American Indian movement, and what other civil rights movement? Right. So again, this was a whole movement for self-determination, and really rising up and fighting for our rights. So we saw that with the American Indian movement that started in urban areas, again, because of that relocation to urban areas, and really was fighting for rights with Alcatraz and with the takeover of Wounded Knee and other periods in history. So we have the self-determination period, and then our latest, really till the present, is the nation-to-nation period, where tribes are seen as nations. So if you talk to tribal members, some people will say, yes, I'm a tribal member, and also people will say, I'm a tribal citizen. I'm a citizen of the Lakota Nation. And so there's something called the National Congress of American Indians. It is a member organization that most tribes belong to. So they do a lot of advocacy work in DC, and they actually put together a guide, sort of a 101 to Indian country. They put this together, but when it was time for them, they had outgrown their offices, and when it was time for them to go to a new office, they actually, instead of calling it offices, they are in an embassy of tribal nations, which is on by DuPont Circle on Mass Ave, close to other embassies. So it's really making a statement, we are nations, and these are citizens of our nations. So it's a different power dynamic, right? Very, very different. And the US government is supposed to treat, again, tribes as nations and have consultations with the tribes as equals on anything that impacts them.
Do they use that term, Indian?
That's a really good question. Terminology is really important. So often people will refer to themselves as Indians, but I don't say, well, I work with Indian people. That's I would say less respectful. So I would say Native American, Native, or Indigenous, which are, again, sort of depending on where you are. But people refer, like, again, my colleagues who are Native American, they would say, oh, I went to an Indian restaurant. Not restaurant, that's it. Well, I mean, there are other Indian restaurants too, but, like, there are a whole bunch of Indians at that, whatever, so they can say that, I can't. Yeah.
Well, wasn't the whole reason why our ancestors started calling them Indians was because Columbus
Thought he was in India, right. So it was a mistake from the beginning, yes, yeah. Yeah, so it's just, yeah, but again, it's stuck and people do refer to themselves that way.
In Canada, they are First Nations.
First Nations.
That's the terminology across the board.
Yeah, again, because they were, right.
And just now that we're talking about identity and how you, what, can you say a little bit about like intermarriage and how they see like intermarriage, assimilation? Who can someone from outside become a part of the tribe?
Yeah, not really, but people are often adopted. So they're not going to become Native American, but if someone has worked really closely with a tribe and very connected to people, they will be adopted by that. That's my adopted family. And people will refer to, that's my adopted brother who might not be originally a tribal member. So I think people are open, and also there are real connections in terms of indigenous identities. So there are, with the folks that I work with in South Dakota, there are definitely folks whose grandparents came, or even they came from Mexico. And so they're Mexican. So, you have US and Mexican, but they connect because they're all indigenous. So I've worked for years and years and years on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And one of my first, and Ruben, my husband, who some of you know, so he's Mexican American. So his grandmother is, his ancestors, his grandparents were indigenous, right? And he looks like that. So I had been working there for, I don't know, my first year or something, and and people just connected to Ruben, and I was like, whoa, I'm working really hard here. And I remember it was my first Christmas there, and I had a little something for the people that I worked with, and they're like, oh, thanks so much. And I was like, okay. And then they said, when's Ruben coming? We have a little something for him. And I was like, wow, okay. And then what's interesting is they greet him in the Lakota language, and he's learned a few words. But he just, he's like, hey, so again, but there's that sort of deep connection as indigenous peoples. So I also want to talk about, history, critical piece of what we're talking about, but also land, right? So the land has been sort of a theme through the historical timeline that we looked at. And again, it's held in trust. So tribes will have land in trust that if you're a tribal member, want to build a house, so either you have allotted land that your family was allotted originally back in 1887, and again, that gets very complicated because there can be many, many relatives that have access to that land, or you have tribal trust land that is held in trust for the tribe. So what you can do is say, okay, I want to build a house, and they'll, what land is available, tribal trust land, and they'll tell you what parcels are available to build on. And so when I first started working in South Dakota, again, we were building houses, and people say, I want to live on my land, which this is what they mean, out in the country. And I was like, out in the country? They're like, the whole thing here is out in the country to me, I'm from the suburbs. But again, people wanted to be where they couldn't see anybody else, they couldn't hear anybody else. And part of that is because how housing has evolved according to this timeline. Then you have fee simple land, which is land that's been taken out of trust, and it's land just like we have here, off of reservations. And so you can imagine that lenders are much more comfortable lending on fee simple land because they can take it, right? So if someone doesn't pay their mortgage, they can take that land back. But the land, again, critical. And I've talked to people that say, wow, it's a really hard situation. Economically, there aren't jobs, there aren't houses. Why don't people just move? Why don't people just move to the city and get a job? And I have asked, I don't ask in that way, but people say, this is my land. This is where I belong, right? And so, yes, yeah, it is really, it is something. But just in terms of land, who else talks about land in a special way? Even if we don't live there, right? I'm going home, even though I've never been there before, right? And when I talk to people who have, I spoke and I worked with someone who grew up in LA. He was born in LA, but his parents were Navajo. So every single summer they would go home to the Navajo Nation. And so he decided to move, and he said, I'm moving back home. Again, he had never lived there. He had been born and raised in LA, but it's home. So I just wanted to draw that out because as we're looking at this, it's a connection to a land and a place that other people don't really understand. Yeah.
Just a question, you were mentioning that these allotted pieces of land where people can build. So if someone builds their home, do they own that home?
You can own the home, yes, especially because often you do need a loan to get the tools and materials to to build a home. You can own the home, but you don't own the land under it. So that's what we tell lenders is actually your collateral for the home is for the mortgage is going to be the home. You can take the home, but you can't take the land. And so that's still scary for folks. And so what we've done is tribes are looking at risk pools and right of first refusal. So if a tribal member has a mortgage with a lender, again, lender can't take the land, but what if the tribal member doesn't pay? So the tribe has an agreement, well, the tribe will buy the home and sell it to another tribal member, right? So that keeps the whole thing back with the tribe. But yeah,
Feel free to answer this later,
Okay.
even later, but why doesn't the federal government just build them housing after consulting with them about what kind of housing they want? Why do they have to go through this commercial marketplace for mortgages?
Well, because I think the federal government isn't committed. They don't have the dollars. They're not giving, what the federal government does is they give each tribe an allocation of housing money. Again, it's based on sort of the self-determination, the Native Americans Housing and Self-Determination Act. So every tribe gets a certain amount of money. It's not that much, but the idea is that they're supposed to leverage it to get other funding. But they want people to get private mortgages. It's just not an option. They're not building. If you look at the amount of money that the federal government puts into tribal communities, it is minimal. If you look at folks, I don't know if we have any healthcare professionals, but they are also, according to treaty, supposed to provide healthcare on reservations. So you have Indian Health Services, IHS. Every single tribe has Indian Health Services, and it is one of the tribes I work with I think they had 8 beds, right? So you have COVID, you have 8 beds during COVID for a tribe that's probably the size of New Jersey. So yeah, so it's just not yeah, and so tribes are fighting all the time for more resources, but the idea is we'll give you a little so you can leverage it to get a traditional mortgage. Yeah. Okay. So land. And this shows something called checkerboarding. So if you have a reservation, this is Standing Rock, which actually is, part of it is in, I think even here. This is North Dakota, this is South Dakota. So it borders the North Dakota-South Dakota border, or it lies over that border. But it's checkerboarding, so it's all different types of land. So you can imagine that's another whole layer if you want to build, or if you want to do economic development and build a subdivision or build a development. Again, the idea that land is looking different. And I literally I worked with a woman and they put it in the wrong place. So they put it like on the wrong spot here. So that's just a part of the land. So the question is, what does housing look like now? And it kind of gets to Anne's question. You have a lot of rental housing that the government provided. So when you think about housing that the government provides, people still have to pay rent, but it's very, very low rental rates. When you think about housing projects in the cities, Chicago, New York, whatever, what connotations come to mind? High rise. What else? You don't have high rises out there, but what else do you have? Expensive. Well, again, for the people who live in them, they're not that necessarily, they're supposed to be really affordable, but there's not a huge sense of pride in living in these. If you think of sort of typical, stereotypical housing developments in city, there's not a lot of pride. You often don't have any control over your neighbors or what they're doing. So there's a sense of fear, really. And that's what you have in the projects on many reservations too. HUD built them. So HUD came in, they built these houses. They're all sort of cookie cutter houses. People are, and again, there are huge waiting lists. Like in the tribes I work with in South Dakota, 2,000 families on a waiting list for one of these rental homes. So you have a lot of rental, because that's been easier for the government to do, so to build it and then just people, and again, not a huge focus on home ownership. There's a huge lack of housing stock. So even if someone has funding, can get a mortgage on many reservations, there's absolutely no housing to buy. So again, we can look in the listings, we look on Zillow, even in these times in Brighton and our area, Pittsford and Penfield, you can still find a house to buy. There's nothing. And so you also look at, how do you appraise the value of a house? What do? You look at the comparable, like who's down the block. Well, how do you do that if there is no block, if there is no down the block? So you have these ripples of no housing stock. And what that means is, even if someone wants to live at home, this is my land, I want to live at home, there's no place to live. So where do they live? Maybe an hour and a half away, like in Rapid City, which is an hour and a half from Pine Ridge. Or they live someplace else entirely. I'd like to live at home, I'd like to raise my family at home, but I can't, there's no place to buy. And again, like I work with a lot of people who, they're like 50% of the people who work on Pine Ridge live someplace else, and 50% of the people who live on Pine Ridge work someplace else. So it's a huge, yeah.
Is there a reason that they went with a rental model versus like, more like a Habitat for Humanity model where things are built and then you can purchase them or with equity? I actually grew up my entire life in low-income housing, and one of the things that I don't think people realize about rental housing is the sense of no control over your own life. Everything is dictated for you, what you can do inside your own home, and like, it almost takes a piece of your identity away. Do you think that was an intentional choice?
I honestly don't know, because it was sort of before my time, but I think if you look at housing for lower income people around the country, for some reason it's this, I think people think it's more affordable. I think there's a patronizing, like you can't handle home ownership sort of thing. But again, if you ask people what they would prefer, I would prefer to own my home and have control over that space and the pride in it again. And so all of my work has been in home ownership. And what's tricky, even today, as we encourage people to focus on home ownership, the rents in these rentals are super low. And so again, it's not a real business model. The housing authorities that run these, they aren't necessarily running on a business model. So they're always just repairing them, versus why don't you help someone build a new house, as you said. And the self-help, so a lot of my work has been self-help housing, so people coming together to build their own homes and save the cost by their labor instead of an outsider's labor. So that self-help model is huge. And my original work on Pine Ridge was to bring that self-help model to the Pine Ridge Reservation. So probably about 30 people built their homes, and it was a federal program that provided support for the self-help. And after a while, the folks were like, this is just, it was like a square peg in a round hole. They were like, we can't do this anymore. So, but it is a great question. Why not home ownership from the beginning? But more and more folks are looking at home ownership now for a bunch of different reasons. As I mentioned, the hesitancy about mortgage lending, right? So on both sides. So the lenders are hesitant because what happens if someone doesn't pay? So HUD has a guaranteed program. So basically, HUD will pay, if a private lender makes a loan to a tribal member to buy a house, HUD will guarantee 99% of that loan. So that's a huge incentive, right? So the private lender has nothing to lose. They're still not doing it. They're only doing it on that fee simple land, because you can do it on fee simple or you can do it on trust. If you look at the data, like 85% of them are going to fee land. That's not why the program was created, right? USDA has a program for low income rural borrowers. And again, it's just not getting to families. The VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, has a program for Native American veterans. That's the only people that qualify. There's no cap on the funding. Like, it's an unlimited supply of funding. And we were working with one region that was in 5 states, and they said, well, we did 9 loans this year in a 5-state region, and there are hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. So there's a disconnect, right, between the programs and the people that can and should be able to access them. Also, home ownership for many tribal members, it's not on their radar. They're not thinking about it. You're thinking kind of day-to-day existence, and you're also, when rental has been the only thing that's available, you sort of assume, well, that's where I'll live. That's where I can live. So that's kind of a backdrop of what when you look at, again, this is on reservations. Many tribal members, Indigenous folks are in urban areas, but again, this is on the reservations. So what I want to do is show what's happening to address these situations, and it's part of what you mentioned as far as home ownership, right? So
Question?
yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay.
Since we're talking about ownership, is there also a cultural reason, other than that they've been socialized to think that they can't own a home? Is there like is there a cultural tribal reason that is like a value? Is there a value about not owning?
Well, I think people generally, when they do lift up home ownership. So I would say there isn't a culture like an anti-home ownership, because they have had homes in the past, again, even back to nomadic times. But it's sort of the why home ownership. And you'll hear someone in this video talk about a wealth building strategy. How do many people who aren't tribal members build wealth and build assets in the United States? It's through home ownership. That's really not a key part of the conversation, but it's home ownership so you can take care of your family. Home ownership so your family has a place in the future. And people have this misunderstanding, like I've been renting in tribal housing, renting my whole life, so when I pass on, my kids will get that house. You know, it goes back to the housing authority. But home ownership, you can, and so part of what we do is we do estate planning and wills and things, so you can really make sure that your home passes on to your family. So it's not an anti-home ownership, but it's kind of like why home ownership. The other thing is there are some low-income housing programs that have restrictions. So you get a grant, for example, and then if you flip the house, if you move, you know, if you fix it up and move on, then you have to pay the grant back. And so a lot of the funders, well, you have to do that. People aren't flipping houses out there. They, you know, you buy a house and it is for your life and then to pass on to your families.
I'm just thinking about this when I go to Ganondagan, there's a longhouse out there. And there are people, a clan lives in a longhouse together. So they live communally. They don't have, I mean, a long time ago, they don't have the heritage of owning an individual house. You live with your clan.
Right.
So I don't know if that figures into people's attitudes today, but
well,
it occurs to me.
Yeah, I think, again, because that was historically how people live. But I think what people are looking at is how can you take those concepts, right, and maybe make them work, or how do you fit those into sort of our current realities? So maybe home ownership, but you set up the community as Ganondagan was, with a central meeting place or something. When we started designing houses in South Dakota, people wanted a bay window because it was rounded. They didn't want to live in a square box. So it's taking some things sort of historically from how we live. They also said bedrooms or whatever, we want a really big gathering and living space, because that's when family gathers, we want to make sure that we have enough space for everyone. So I think it's not necessarily people in longhouses anymore, but I actually have seen houses in the, you know, when folks are building apartments in some native communities, they are looking at that. Again, historically, how did we live?
Like having a communal space.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
I thought there was a tribal concept that people could not own the land, that the land was, I don't know how to express it, but it couldn't be owned by human beings.
Right. Well, I think there are two things. One is, again, people don't see it as land, as something you can own. But I think, again, in terms of today's world, people are open to a mortgage. But again, you're still not owning that land. That land is in trust. And it's also, again, looking at what the federal government has done. But you're right. There has not been a concept of ownership. Yeah.
Why don't the code talk during World War II? Why didn't they GI and weren't they able to get GI benefits?
Yes, I'm sure they were, but it's a matter of accessing them. And, you know, there are offices, there's probably an office here in Rochester, there are offices in cities, but the problem is that sometimes you have programming and you have no way to access it on the reservation, right? So again, this program, the Native American Direct Loan that I mentioned, their offices are in St. Paul, probably 8 hours from the western part of South Dakota. Do they have an office out there? Do they send staff out there? No. So someone just kind of gets an application, they send it along, it's missing a piece, and that's that. You know, that kind of thing. So programs exist, it's a matter of making them accessible. I think that's the issue.
After World War II, a lot of people of color who had been in the armed forces were not allowed to get more benefits. So I'm wondering if the natives were included in that bunch, or if they were thought of separately.
I don't know, but it's a great question, Donna. We can definitely look at it. I know today, again, there are the programs. I don't know right after the war, but it is a good. So I do want to show, again, we've talked about kind of what things look like, but what folks are doing, these promising practices. So hopefully.
The river's huge. People lived on it, lived by it. Even the sweetgrass was by the water. They collect that, they use that in ceremonies. There's just something soothing about it. It's just almost like your mother.
Our people are migratory. Each family clan had a tributary along the river. And over time, we had been eaten away. Finally, up to the turn of this century, this is our last village.
What's his name?
up until 1980, there hasn't been a single mortgage on this land. Housing is the #1 way that the lower middle class and middle class folks are able to pull themselves up to accumulate wealth. That's been historically denied on this reservation.
The Penobscot Indian Nation invited us to participate on this LEED project for residential housing. They have a lot of features to reduce the overall cost for the tenants.
We subsidized the construction up front, but upon completion, we sold them to tribal members. Families said, wow, I didn't realize that you could actually get a loan on the reservation and have a direct one-to-one relationship with their financial institution.
I moved from a mobile home, and it's roughly the same square footage, about 1,100 square feet. My electricity was less than half of what it was at the other place. Radiant heat is great. It's great to wake up and have a warm floor to step on. It's such a comfortable home.
By helping other people help themselves, then we're able to use our minimal funding to help those that at this point in their lives are not able to help themselves, the most needy and needy.
One of the things this housing project did was actually trigger off the master planning for the island. Master planning actually started integrating medicine trails that brought you through the island.
There are a lot of native plants here that are actually used in medicines or in ceremonies.
By walking this one trail, you can almost tell them about our whole history, how we interacted with the different aspects of the land, whether the island, whether the river, our creation myths. It also served to connect the housing with the essential governmental services, and it got people out and walking. So you will find people coming through here all the time. One of the other groups of people that we reached out to were hunters, fishermen, guides. When we put that dock in there, it drew kids like magnets. So many of the elders remarked at how that brought them back in time, that was a memory that they hadn't seen in so long.
In the evening, I myself have gone down there to just sit, just enjoy the beauty of the area. The whole concept of the community was to, be closer to the earth and more a part of it and leave less damage behind. It has been a revitalization of this island. Younger people can come back home and live here with their families and not have to leave to get housing. People just realize, maybe I can go home.
Now, just to get out of here, escape. Okay, so any reflections? What struck you in watching that, in terms of what we've been talking about?
I liked it. It feels encouraging, but it also feels like it's like in the bucket of what we raise people.
It's true. It's true. 10 homes. But for those families, and also I think every project is a model of what can happen, right? The homes and the community, and I think you're right. So it could be, when I look at the numbers in South Dakota, it's maybe 500 loans or whatever over maybe 8 years or something, which isn't that many, but I think it's a starting point. And I think everything is a model and a best practice, really. But I think you're right, Elise. Richard, and then.
But it takes commitment and it takes money. Where is this money going to come from?
Well, I think you're right. There is a federal obligation, that's some of it, right? And people are, again, qualifying. There are jobs, right? So in tribal communities, people are working in tribal government, in healthcare, in education. There are jobs, so people can afford it. And I think you mentioned it too. There's still sort of a commitment to rental housing and to more affordable subsidized housing, but the folks that can afford mortgages and home ownership, then that frees up other units. But you're right, it needs all those things. But the first thing is a commitment and a vision, I think. to make it happen, and a belief that it can happen.
I think that Native Americans is being really in tune with nature, so it's really important to me that those homes are lead homes. And I'm quite sure that they're more expensive to build that way, but then the investment
It's worth it in the
is
long
worth
run,
it.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Donna?
Excuse me, I like the way they took into account the history of the natives and what they used to do.
Right.
And made sure that there was a way that they could access that again.
Right, so it's coming back to, right,
Right.
right. So much has been imposed, and so the idea is, again, taking back ownership and taking back voices. And I have to say, again, this is what I focus my work on, but I think as we think about next steps and what else can we do, it's not just us that are talking about, but also tribal members that are talking about their own experience. Then they're real, and so it's listening to the voices, and I think, we're not great, sometimes we're not always good listeners, oh, we know best, or we've seen this do, work well here. So I think it's, again, part of this, the answer, Richard said it takes commitment and resources, it also takes listening to what communities want. Elise, did you?
Does the level of funding from the US government fluctuate depending on who's in the White House?
Yes, yes. So we're trying to get something passed now, and it's like one of those things you add on to another bill that, hopefully that bill will pass, and yes, it does depend on what kind of priorities. Yes, absolutely. I did want to just, yeah.
Just looking at this from more of a cultural point of view, I mean, I want to live in one of those homes.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of interesting, like how, like we keep seeing, like, maybe like sort of what we're used to sort of in this sort of capitalistic culture, where expensive homes that work this way isn't the best way. And just like, again, depending who's in office and this and that, what we see is like what we actually all should look for.
Right, right, yeah.
What are the Indian nations' top priorities for what they would like to achieve going forward?
Well, I think when you ask, and I've been working on an effort in South Dakota where it's a statewide homeownership coalition. So you have housing authorities, you have lenders, you have the state agency, federal agencies, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But now we've been asked to help support a similar effort in Wisconsin. So we're starting to talk to people in Wisconsin. And is housing even a priority? It's housing, it's education, and it's health. Those are the priorities. So not a huge surprise. But I would say those are what we're hearing. Okay, so I did want to just mention, and people, I know sometimes we stay over a little, till like 1:15, is that?
Kind of, it's, well, the hard fact is that by 11 a.m. another class starts here.
Okay.
But probably usually until 1:15.
Okay,
Time.
okay. So I did want to just tell you about this effort because, tying back to me and my work, so we've sort of talked, again, history and the land, but okay, well, what do you do, really? So there is this South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition, and I've been working with a person for a long time. She's a member of the Oglala Lakota Nation, so she grew up and was raised on Pine Ridge. She was the first, and so USDA has state offices, state programs. So she was the state director for USDA in South Dakota. And again, USDA has a mortgage loan for low-income borrowers, and it wasn't going to any Native families. So she said, this is not just a USDA problem. We all have to come together. And then you have the state agency, which is very sort of hands-off. No, you have your own money and that kind of thing. So she said, we need to have a meeting of all the different stakeholders and see if they'd form a coalition. So she asked Seven Sisters, my organization, back in 2013 to help facilitate a meeting, a one-day meeting where people are interested. And she said, we don't just want the state housing agency that has funding, that should be supporting these efforts. We don't want them to just come. We'll have them host it, so then they'll definitely come. So they hosted, they did breakfast and lunch, and they've been involved ever since. And so now there are at least 100 stakeholders, all the different players that impact housing and home ownership in South Dakota, both native and non-native. And that's also really important because often it's one or the other, and without a lot of partnerships or understanding. So I wanted to tell you just a little, so they're continuing now, we are 12 years later. They were a small sort of informal organization with a fiscal sponsor. Now they have their own 501c3, they have their own staff, so my role has kind of stepped back a lot. But I just wanted to tell you about a couple of things that they've done which I think is really promising and addresses some of the issues that we mentioned. So they're construction internship, right? So you have these communities with no houses to buy and really high unemployment rates, up to 85% in some communities. So we talked to contractors, why aren't you building more houses? You know how to build. They tend to build the bigger projects, hospitals and commercial things. Well, people can't afford it. We said, okay, we're looking at that. Credit issues. Okay, we're working with folks to improve their credit, fix their credit reports. And they said, and there's no one to hire. We're like, no one to hire? What do you mean? And they said, well, no one that they wanted to hire, no one that they trusted. And we said, well, what if we develop an internship where folks could work with you for the summer? We would do a stipend, so they get some income over the summer. And then if they do a good job, you can hire them. But you're also training them, and it's hands-on work to help folks get other jobs too. So that started in 2017, has started on 2 reservations, and now it's on 5. So that, just the idea that that's happening. And we had a funder that said, okay, well, we focus on financial education, how to do budgeting and that kind of thing. Can you provide financial education classes for the interns? Because the other piece was there was a college program on these reservations. Many tribes have their own colleges. There were people studying building trades who still weren't connecting with the contractors. So we're going to work with the students and then place them in these internships. We're going to teach a financial education class. And the students were like, I just want to be on the job site. You know, I want to be earning my paycheck, financial education, whatever. But then at the end, when we did exit interviews, what was the most valuable part of this program for you? The financial education. Because I was getting a paycheck every other week and it helped me budget it. And I was able to buy groceries for my grandma. I was able to buy a used car. So financial education is sometimes very theoretical, but this was real for them. So that I wanted to mention that. Statewide Housing Conference. So I talked about the State Housing Agency in South Dakota. They every year have a conference. Most states have a housing conference every year. And so when we started, they said, could you as a coalition do your own workshops? Could you do some workshops on Native American home ownership? Okay, sure. So we started doing some workshops and people started coming to the conference. Tribal members started coming. Before the conference, before the coalition, there were probably 200 or 300 people would come to this conference. Maybe we looked at the records from previous years, pre-coalition, maybe 8 to 10 people would come, either tribal members or people from Native organizations. But once there were relevant workshops, now there are 75 to 100 people coming every year. So it's literally changed the conference. What also started happening is we would have the Native workshops and the regular workshops, and it was kind of segregated, right? So people would go to there, and then over time, right, as we did more workshops and people became more familiar in the field, there was much more crossover. So we were doing workshops, for example, on amenities to think about, like walking paths and gardens and things when you're building. So that was the most widely attended workshop at the conference. And then our folks are also going to the other workshops. So the conference, the relending program. So again, this USDA has this loan program that I mentioned that wasn't going to native borrowers. Now, some native communities have loan funds. So they're called Community Development Financial Institutions, and they are certified by the Department of Treasury. So they get capital and they make loans to tribal members for business or home ownership, primarily. So we looked and we said, okay, these loans aren't going to tribal members. What if you make a loan to the loan fund in the community? They'll loan, and then they'll make the loans. So that took...
Hello, and welcome to the training for the Fair Housing Act's accessibility requirements.
Okay, all right, Feliza.
This training is approximately 1.5 hours in length. Please note that unexpected interpreters are unable to attend today's training. We will have closed captions, or open captions, excuse me, going from Microsoft.
Let's minimize that.
Please note that the workbook
Something turned on.
Yeah, I think it was
the
for
entire
my other
script
movie.
for today's training. Under the GoToWebinar platform, you'll find several dashboard items. These include the viewing screen. You'll see at the top of the viewing screen, it's going to state whose screen that you're viewing, and will allow you to zoom in or screenshot the items on your
Turn the volume
screen.
down?
Oh, yeah.
The webcam function should be disabled.
Okay. So I do want to just show one thing. One other piece here, just because I know
we have 5 minutes. Though.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's literally 2 minutes, and I think just to kind of end us here, as we're doing that, if we can just get back to
How
where.
do you get back to the PowerPoint? Which is the PowerPoint?
Toward the bottom.
Oh, there it is. Sorry.
Yeah, and let's just go.
From the current slide? Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, I think if we go and do another video, hopefully that will just. Okay, so that's again, again with our group that visited, but let's see. So I just wanted to mention, and hopefully.
I'll minimize this.
Okay, and hopefully. Okay, so. Yeah, no, we need, do you know how?
Oh, but then it might be a,
And then hit submit at the bottom.
unfortunately,
Okay,
there's
this
two
one.
things playing at the same time.
Okay, now. Okay.
There you go. Okay, good. Yay, it worked.
Again, please, I don't know what I would do.
No, you did it.
Well, it was like that.
How do I?
I've always just wanted a house ever since I was a kid, because we didn't really grow up having homes. We just
Oh, I'm
had
sorry.
these little places, and they never feel like home, and they're small, and they don't really have
Sorry.
anything of you
Wait a
in them,
minute.
so I've always wanted a home. You have to just kind of make up your mind that if you want to be a homeowner, then you have to make some sacrifices and long commitments.
At first, I was a little intimidated, you know, just because it's my first time of getting out there and whatnot, but I kind of got over the fear and decided to take it in my own hands and just do what I can to provide for my family. I grew up kind of in a struggle, I guess. No bedrooms, no running water, so we kind of grew up tough, and that's kind of, you know, made me who I am today.
When I was 28 years old, I didn't know what owning a home was like, really. I just wanted a quiet neighborhood to move into to raise children. And we needed a place that they could call home.
We're raising a little guy who's 3 years old. Our little girl is 10. They're going to inherit the land. They're going to inherit whatever we build out here. So it's going to be here for them.
It's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, very big living room and kitchen. It's pretty big for us.
We have a 1957 old house. It's like ranch style. It's really nice. And it's in Timberlake, South Dakota. It's on 2 lots, 1,800 square feet. Beautiful yard, nice big garage background.
The advantage of it is I got a place to call home.
So you get to make improvements on it, and you get to have guests over and not worry about things breaking down.
Yeah, it's ours. And we can do whatever we want to with it. If we want an addition, we can have an addition.
You can save up and plan ahead a little bit better than what you could do in a renting situation. For a 1-bedroom apartment, I was paying $600, and then you still have to pay utilities on top of that, and I didn't own it. When I'm paying now in my house, $700 a month, including property taxes and insurance and things like that. So it's such a better deal to know that you're investing in something versus just kind of throwing your money into something else that you will never own.
In the end, it's a long process, but it's worth it. Rewarding, and you have your own home for your family.
But deep down, I still feel great because we own a home.
Just go for it. Be courageous.
You're going to end up loving it once you get your own home.
It's worth it. Just go in and see what options are available to you.
So just to close, as I was mentioning, home ownership, it often is not on people's radar. So this coalition said, well, how can we get it on people's radar? So they made a video series with people from the community talking about what they had done, right? So it's not outsiders coming and telling people. These are, your neighbors, your cousins, your relatives. And again, just to close, I think if we think about 3 sort of strands that I hope came through today. One is history, right? And the impact of history on today. The land the idea of coming home, and also family. I think it's also, family and community is one of our key values too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I kind of feel like I want to do a standing ovation. So, but we will do it sitting down. But in my mind, it's a standing ovation. I'm wowed. Someone who knew very, very little about the topic. I feel like I've learned so much, and I got also very inspired by your work, the work that you do. I think it's a wonderful combination, to me at least, of something that is on the one hand very practical, and then also is full of values, really, if you feel your devotion, inspiration, I'm sure we all sense that it's coming from a place of personal commitment to the highest values, but also finding a practical way to go about it, which to me is amazing and mind-blowing. I want to also reaffirm another principle of whole of the bagel is how much knowledge and experience we have in our own community.
Yes, yes.
So that the resources that we have, it's like rather than that lack, oh, we don't have, we can't find it. No, we as a body of people, and Leslie, you're such an example of that. There's so much knowledge and experience that we can learn from one another. So I think that is just to see how we can continue in that way. Just a second. And maybe the last point is that your work inspires, I think, us. You also, the other hat of you, which is the Social Action Committee, right, as a congregation that wants to do good things in the world, in the country where we live, in the area where we live, these models that we can,
support and
support, but also come up with models that are, practical and make a real impact in the world. That's something to think about. So thank you so much again. There was another comment or question.
Well, just history, land, and family are also Jewish themes.
Yeah.
But this contention, right, between the U.S. government and Native American governments, I think there's also a comparison to be had there around housing issues in Israel and Palestine, right? A huge source of contention.
So speaking of that, well, yes and no. I mean, not to make draw a one-to-one parallel, but about the next week's lecture will bring us back to Israel. And Tamir Nir, who was here as a visiting rabbi, he gave a sermon in July, who's the rabbi of a congregation in Jerusalem, will teach us on Zoom. And interestingly enough, the model of their congregation in Jerusalem, their entire congregation was created in a garden. They don't have a home. And their entire congregation is based upon the connection with nature and the work they do on the land in the middle of Jerusalem. But it's like, I was there, it's very different than our model. So just as we go on our journey and we echo, is America like Israel? Yes, no, whatever. There's more to say about that than we can right now. So please come up next week. We'll be here together. I won't be here because I'll be with it's a national, but Cantor Brown will be moderating, and Tamir Nir, Rabbi Tamir Nir, will be on Zoom from Jerusalem, teaching us about the ecological garden Reformed Jewish community in Jerusalem. Right? So there's many threads that we're weaving here together. So thank you so much again, Leslie, and let's keep up the good work, guys. Please take a moment, if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to pass through the sukkah on your way out, shake the lulav, connect to your tribal roots as nomadic people. All right? Have a great morning. Thank you. This was fascinating.
Good. Okay, let's see. End the meeting.